Thanks so much for joining us. This is yet another lunchtime lecture brought to you by the Department of the Interior. On behalf of the Department of the Interior Museum, I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Diana Ziegler and I'm the director here at the museum. Today we're in for a treat, literally and figuratively. We'll be tasting some kudzu jelly after the lecture that our lecturers so graciously provided for us. Jason Goldberg. Jason Goldberg is a Fish and Wildlife Service biologist in Washington, D.C., and he's with the branch of aquatic invasive species, where his portfolio ranges from budget development to injurious wildlife management. He's also worked for the service's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Offices and branch of budget performance and policy. He started his career as a Knaus Fellow working for Representative Abercrombie on Capitol Hill, and previously served with NOAA, so National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration Research's External Affairs team for several years prior to joining the service. He earned a master's degree in marine science and a master's of public policy from the College of William and Mary. Susan earned a BS in marine science from the Richard Stockton College of New Jersey and a PhD in aquatic ecology from Kent State University. In graduate school, she focused on invasive species science, developing several research projects to identify characteristics of aquatic habitats and that may render them vulnerable to biological invasion. Susan currently works as the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for NOAA at the NOAA Fisheries Headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland, where she focuses on internal communication and planning, provides training, and composes guidance documents and management plans to ensure NOAA is effectually taking action to prevent and control invasive species. So please join me in welcoming Jason Goldberg and Susan.
Thank you, Diana. Well, good afternoon. Well, we were hoping to make this a culinary class. There were some issues with that, but instead, hopefully, we have a good talk for you today. What we want to do is, we all know about the problems that invasive species cause. They've been in the media, we see them on TV, and today, what Susan and I are here to try to talk to you about are the results of our research into one of the more unusual and, dare we say, entertaining solutions. We do believe that harvesting invasives can be effective under many circumstances, but it's not as easy as it first appears. So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss how successfully using harvest as a tool depends on understanding the species, where it's from, and requires careful monitoring and evaluation to make it a success. So let's talk about some of the problems that invasive species cause. By any estimate, invasives are costing this country now billions of dollars a year, if not more, in damage to agriculture, to wildlife resources, to public use and health and recreation. For example, nutria, the rodent there on your top left, were introduced to our country and bred for their fur. Well, either through the market crashing for the fur or through escape, they have now entered into wetlands in Maryland, Louisiana, Pacific Northwest, where they're destroying the marshes, thus impacting wildlife habitats, storm damage mitigation that those marshes cause, contaminant mitigation that those wetlands cause, and lionfish, top right there, are slowly eating their way through the mid-Atlantic, up along from the Caribbean up to the Northeast, slowly diminishing all the biodiversity of our marine habitats. Kudzu, plant there on the left, has threatened large areas of the South, and it's a menace that's threatening to take over the South at the rate of a foot a day. And sea lamprey, the invasive type that you're seeing there on the right, threaten the multi-billion-dollar fishery in the Great Lakes. So again, these and other species, many others that we could capture, all represent significant threats to America. And so from a practical perspective, why not considering harvesting invasives and doing something useful with them?
So why not start and get a nice good night's sleep by resting on a nutria pillow? Then in the morning, wake up, throw on your nutria boots, and feed your best friend some nutria dog food.
All right, we talked about kudzu. Well, in the morning, you might as well go ahead and take a kudzu herbal pill, or potentially even have a little kudzu jelly with your toast and tea.
Or perhaps you have a busy day at work. Very important to make sure you look sharp, put on your cane-toed belt, running errands, make sure you grab that matching cane-toed purse.
Your kids have a Little League game this weekend? Make sure they got plenty of carp hot dogs for after the game.
Or perhaps you're in for a weekend barbecue. Bring some lionfish, throw it on the grill, and don't forget those lionfish earrings. Or perhaps Consider whipping up a dessert. Why not a sea lamprey pie? May actually sound a little bit strange, but this has actually been a traditional dish eaten by royalty since the Middle Ages.
We're sticking with the kudzu, okay, as a treat. Now, let's say, of course, you're going out. We are getting into winter. You want to have a nice night on the town, but it's a little bit chilly. Well, don't forget to bring that ever-popular possum scarf for those cold evenings. And this is made out of possum. And of course, after the show, don't forget, you need to have a nice night out. Why not wrap your evening with an elegant dinner consisting of some invasive gray squirrel, little goat cheese, and maybe a little hazelnut crostini? Just saying. So everything that you've just seen is a real product. We're not making any of this stuff up. The idea is that this is just a mini sample, the many different ways in which invasives can be used. Food, biofuels, clothing, all these are possible options. And harvesting appears to offer what is a simple solution to controlling invasive species populations. But is it really a win-win? And how and when should government get involved?
All right, so one of the questions we are commonly asked is, humans are great at driving animals to extinction through harvest. So why really can't we take that same idea and apply it towards invasive species management? Seems to make sense, but this is really a question Jason and I want to explore in a much more rigorous way. So when we first started this analysis, we did focus on incentive programs, mainly financial, in which the incentive was offered for the removal of an invasive species. So I'll give you an example of some of the type of the programs that are currently going on. We have bounty programs. Bounty program is a type of program where you have a predetermined amount of money paid to an individual for the collection of a specified organism. So for example, in Louisiana, for years they have offered a bounty on nutria. So if you are a registered participant, you could get $5 per nutria tail. And their goal is pretty much to eliminate or reduce the impact of coastal wetlands by harvesting approximately 400,000 nutria every single year. 2013 marked the year of the Python Challenge. So this was a month-long competition in which cash prizes were offered for individuals who caught the most snakes as well as the largest snake. We also have contract operations, and this is where a service provider is hired to harvest a species. So for example, states have actually been going out and hiring commercial fishermen to harvest Asian carp, recognizing that they have the gear, they have the crew, and most importantly, they have the experience to actually harvest as many fish as they possibly can. Weed control is nothing new. Right now in the United States, we are spending approximately $500 million every single year to remove weeds from residential properties. May seem like a lot, but we spend $1 billion every year to remove weeds from golf courses. And this is nothing in comparison to how much we spend to remove invasive weeds from natural areas, which is considerably higher. So we also have commercial markets. And this is where a perceived market exists for a species and is harvested usually by private entities, made into a product and offered for sale. So Jason and I gave a lot of different examples at the beginning of our talk, but the point again is that things have actually progressed quite a bit from the days of George Costanza wearing the nutria hat. We are seeing, no one remembers the Seinfeld restaurant, really? All right. Thought I was getting old. All right, so anyway, invasive species really have developed into a lot of different clothing, accessories. You can go into a restaurant, see them on a menu, and they also are being considered for use of biofuel as well. So again, recreational harvest is another type of program where recreational activities such as fishing, hunting, trapping of invasive species are encouraged. Now this may or may not include a financial component, but usually it will consider activities such as modifying the hunting season or the fishing season. Perhaps you need to go in and modify bag limits or license requirements. And so once again, we are seeing several examples of these harvest activities that are occurring in the recreational side. For example, we're seeing fish derbies. You can find them for lionfish, you can see them from Asian carp. We're also seeing activities and programs such as Target Hunger Now, which is when they're encouraging hunting, angling, and they're encouraging them to donate the meat or the fish, which is then processed into meals to feed underprivileged families. So the bottom line, when you look at it from the outside, it really does appear that there are a lot of different benefits to these type of harvest incentive programs. For example, they can actually supplement existing control and management programs for invasive species. They offer a very unique, perhaps cost-efficient way to reduce invasive species populations, and also they do receive a lot of attention. And what this is it does generate a significant public awareness as well as engagement.
Okay, so it sounds great, right? Well, let's talk about some of the problems. many people believe that this idea of actually harvesting has been around fairly recently if you look at all the media and all the attention that's been given to it, but it's actually been in the public eye considerably longer. Even no less a personality than Mark Twain weighed on the subject back in the early 1900s in his autobiography, when he noted that the best way to increase wolves in America, rabbits in Australia, and snakes in India is to pay a bounty on their scalps, and then every patriot goes to raising them. So what's he talking about? Let me tell you a little story. There are many aspects that need to be considered when you're looking at a harvest program, and we'll touch on these throughout the rest of our talk. Go back to the early 1900s. At the time, the British government was ruling India at the time, and they thought they would try to help out the people of India by eliminating their cobra problem. So what they did was they offered a bounty on every cobra that the people of India captured. Well, what ended up happening was the people discovered that it was actually cheaper to breed the snakes in their own homes and then sell the snakes back to the government. When the British government got word of this and figured out what was going on, they stopped the bounty. Of course, then all the people who were breeding these snakes suddenly released them out to the environment. Another good example, around the same time, Vietnam, same kind of issue. They were having an issue with rats in their cities. And they thought, well, let's go ahead and let's offer a bounty for every tail that's brought in. Similar issue. Instead of breeding them, the people would go out to the sewers, capture the rats, snip off the tails, and then drop the tail back into the sewer, where they were then free to continue breeding willy-nilly, making the problem even worse. So this idea has now come to become and known in the public policy vernacular as a perverse incentive, one where you're trying to offer something to the public to deal with a problem, and you make the problem even worse. You often hear this sometimes referred to as the Cobra effect. There's actually a really good Freakonomics podcast on this a couple of weeks ago. So that's one issue. You can actually make the problem worse by trying to offer the incentive. Another issue, and I'll touch base on this one later on as well, is that you're also creating opportunities for additional spread. If someone likes an invasive, they may either intentionally spread it to another area that may be closer to their home, or they may intentionally release it in the hopes of trying to breed it later on. You can also, and this is another thing you have to consider, is you may create a long-term market and demand. You're giving people a taste of the species. Afterwards, we're going to let you sample some of the kudzu. Well, if you really like it, are you going to want to have kudzu around? Those are some of the different issues that we have to think about. So let's get into some of the different issues that we did look at, both the biological and socioeconomic side of where our recommendations come from.
So foremost, biological considerations. So when you're developing a type of harvest or incentive program, really understanding population dynamics is going to be the foundation, not just for harvest, but really the foundation for any invasive species management program. And the reason this is that invasive species, they exhibit very distinct traits that aid their ability to survive in the habitat. So consequently, those same principles that we use to manage endangered species or manage game species are not going to be necessarily applicable to managing invasive species. So one of the few things to consider is, first of all, those removal rates. In order to reduce a population, your mortality is always going to need to be greater than the birth rate. So when you are developing a type of program, very important that you have a basic understanding of things like the target species, reproductive rate, survival rate, its immigration, emigration into your management area. So let's take a look at two different case studies. So on the left here, we have the Lionfish study. Now, models have shown that removal rates for lionfish are fairly high, somewhere in the ballpark between 27 to 65%. Definitely very high. However, what we're seeing is that when we do those one-day fishing derby events, we're actually able to remove up to 60% of the lionfish from a particular area. So this really does show that there is some potential for these derby events to actually go into localized area, reduce the lionfish, and protect potentially ecological important areas. Further, also once these removal events take place, we're seeing increase in the native fish species populations, up to about 70%. So once again, what we can take from this is that eradication is not necessarily always essential in order to achieve some ecological benefits. But on the other side here, we have garlic mustard. Garlic mustard also does have very high removal rates in order to reduce that population. Again, somewhere between 85 to 95%. But the challenge with invasive plants, however, is that usually when you go and harvest, you're not taking away that entire organism. A lot of times you're going to leave things such as the seeds, the reproductive parts, and that could be enough to trigger brand new population. So another issue to consider is the size of the invasion. So once again, we have two different case studies. The first one shows a program for nutria eradication that took place in Great Britain. This program was started in 1981. What they did is they hired about 24 trappers to go in and take out the nutria. And in about 10 years, the trappers simply couldn't find any more nutria. So the program was declared successful, ended. Nutria have since been eradicated in Great Britain. However, the similar program is very unlikely they would be successful in the United States, simply because the nutria invasion here, much larger, much more widespread. For example, in Louisiana alone, populations are about 10 times greater than they ever were over in Great Britain. So that right there really shows us that eradication is not going to be nearly as easy here, simply because of the greater resources, greater time, greater efforts that's going to be needed. That, however, does not necessarily we can't have local successes. For example, right now in Maryland, they're coming very close to eradicating nutria populations from Delmarva Peninsula. But again, widespread across the United States, eradication, not likely. So another issue to consider is this idea of overcompensation. So biological overcompensation really is the concept that species populations may actually benefit when they start to decline. And we have seen this issue in Australia. Australia ran the Australian Victorian Fox Bounty Trial, in which hunters were actually paid to actually go into an area and remove the fox. And they were successful. Hunters removed about 20% of the red fox populations, but what they found is that reduction actually stimulated a population increase. Because what happened, fox populations went down, valuable resources such as food, habitat become available, made it much easier for those that remained to survive. So easier survival, much easier to raise a healthy litter, therefore populations go up. So if they found this out, of course, the program was terminated, and they actually later did a study to find out that removal rates for red fox probably need to be close to about 65% removal in order to see a reduction. So much higher than the 20% that they achieved with the bounty program. So once again, full circle comes back to really having a handle on your population dynamics of your target species. And third factor to consider is immigration. So even if you do achieve local successes, you do need to remember it's always possible for that target animal to re-invade your area. And this really is the primary reason why we see much more eradication, successful eradication on islands versus the mainland. So again, let's go back at the nutria example. So Great Britain, great job, eradication achieved. However, reinvasion probably not as likely. Most likely would have to happen through some sort of human intervention, either intentionally or unintentionally, or nutria would have to become really good swimmers. But in the United States, even if we do achieve those local successes, such as in Maryland or Louisiana, much easier for the animals to actually reinvade from a neighboring state. Species don't know jurisdictional boundaries. So again, even when you are doing some sort of control program, still important to remember things like prevention, monitoring, early detection, rapid response are still going to be very important. So catch per unit effort can be a real problem. So this is a picture that was submitted to us from the National Park Service. And of course, it is a picture of a 9-foot orange python. So I'm going to give everyone a minute and go ahead and just raise your hand when you find that python. And Jason will hum the Jeopardy music.
Just sit there at the base of the tree. Yeah.
I will give you a big hint in 3, 2, 1.
Yeah.
Oh, there's the animation. Pause. All right. So, of course, the point of this is snakes are difficult to find because they're cryptic. And really, again, that's the point. So not only this cryptic behavior make it really difficult to find them, but it's also going to make it really difficult to evaluate the success of your program. For example, in southern Florida, Burmese python populations right now are estimated somewhere between 5,000 and 180,000. Huge range. So obviously, without accurate information, it's going to make it really difficult to judge how successful your program is, how many are being removed versus how many are actually left. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, if you are going to do some sort of incentive program, people are actually going to want to go out there and find what they're looking for. They're not going to want to spend hours looking for it. So if you have animals that are very cryptic, or maybe they're in an area that's difficult to access, or maybe it's just an area that's very isolated, certain options are going to become more unlikely. Or that, or you're really going to have to be prepared to offer a greater incentive for the amount of effort it's going to take them to find and locate these animals. So another issue to consider is density. So it has argued that the first 99% of a population is easier to remove than that last 1%. And the reason for this argument is that as populations start to get lower, once again, it's going to be really hard to find those last remaining individuals. So at this point of the time, that really is where incentive programs begin to lose their effectiveness, simply because whatever incentive you offer can become an insufficient motivator. And also we need to consider this whole issue of the tyranny of the small numbers. So invasive species, as Jason kind of indicated at the very beginning of the talk here, they're notorious for their fast growth. And what this means is even when you narrow it down to a last few individuals, they can very quickly recover as well. So for this reason, eradication really can be a high-risk undertaking, and any sort of control effort is going to require careful consideration and should be only undertaken if there is that strong commitment and ability to remove nearly every individual. So really, once again, you're actually going to be spending more time and more effort at those final stages of the program. And they're also the most important as well, because if you end a program prematurely, what's going to happen is numbers of your invasive species, your target species, most likely are going to go back to your pre-program levels. And what this is going to happen, it's going to result in a lot of wasted time, a lot of wasted money, and more importantly, it may actually provide criticism that may impede future efforts. So, a couple of take-home messages. If you remember anything from what I just said, here's what it comes down to. Is when you are developing any sort of harvest or control program, very important to understand your population dynamics. Simply because you do need to anticipate the program's impact on the target species and determine, again, that removal rate. How much do you need to take out in order to reduce those populations? And lastly, it's also very important to prevent that reinduction. Once again, your program is only going to be successful if you can keep the numbers low. You need to make sure that they're not able to immigrate back into your management area. So just switching gears here for a second, we focus on some of the biological considerations for a harvest control program, but let's talk about some of the ecological considerations as well. So biological invasion typically results in a loss of biodiversity. One thing it can also do is it can change a lot of the ecosystem processes in the ecosystem as well. For example, we can see this in numerous species. One of the pictures I have up here is a fire tree, which is an invasive species to Hawaii. What happens when it gets into those volcanic soils, it actually can quadruple nitrogen content. We also can see alterations in ecosystems through zebra quagga mussels. We could fill a whole hour talking about ecological consequences of zebra quagga mussels. But the bottom line, what it comes down to is they're great filter feeders. One zebra quagga mussel can actually filter about 1 quart of water every single day. So what happens is water becomes clearer, more light can penetrate, temperatures begin to rise, nutrients are removed from the open water down to the bottom of the lake, and so ultimately what it's doing is it's changing what type of animals can live there, changing ecosystems, changing food webs, changing trophic relationships. But what it really comes down to is just the knowledge that all these changes in ecosystem properties mean that simply restoring in a native ecosystem means more than just taking out the invader. One real life example we can provide here is in New Zealand, very successful harvest program to reduce red deer populations. But what they found is even when red deer populations were very low, they weren't really seeing any positive benefits coming out. And this is because when they were established, they pretty much browsed everything that they could eat within their range. And this changed litter properties, soil properties, the litter quality. It really did hinder the recovery of native ecosystems. Another ecological consideration is the alteration of food webs. So when an invasive species is introduced, very typical for it to become a new predator, maybe a new food source. And what that means is when you remove it, you may throw off trophic relationships. And so this may cause additional harm to native species that have come to depend on that invasive. We also have ecological release. So imagine you have one invader in an ecosystem, and it's actually keeping populations of other invasive species very low. Maybe it's preying on them, maybe it's simply competing with them, but when you remove that invasive species, very possible that may cause a ecological release of a second, perhaps more problematic invasive species. So for example, Hawaii has seen this. They did an event where they went and removed a lot of the feral pigs, goats, and sheep from their grasslands, but what they found is when they were removed, all these flammable invasive grasses began to grow. And this really did a lot of changing of the fire regime and caused numerous other complex problems. And lastly, one of the ecological considerations is that invasive species may have a positive association with native species. For example, a great example is salt cedar removal. This was an effort that was repeatedly delayed in the western states simply because it was found that that salt cedar provided a significant habitat for an endangered bird, which was the willow flycatcher. Further complicated because salt cedar, when it is established, it does things such as change water levels, increases salinity. So even if you were to take out the invasive salt cedar, it's going to make it really difficult for the native vegetation to regrow for those endangered birds. So once again, just a couple of take-home messages on ecological consequences. First of all, again, very important to make sure you understand some of those potential ecological outcomes that I just spoke about. Again, invasive species have very complicated relationships with the environment, very difficult to predict the outcome once you remove them. So it really does require a very careful evaluation before you begin any sort of control, harvest, or incentive program. And last but not least, restore the native ecosystems. I gave numerous examples of situations where restoration simply isn't a matter of going in there and taking out the invasive species. You really want to make sure you do a complete restoration in order to achieve those ecological benefits, make sure you are reducing the impacts to the environment as well as the impacts to the economy as well. And with that, I will turn it to Jason to bring it home.
Thank you. So now we're going to start talking about human health and safety, some of the socioeconomic issues. Before we do that, I would just like to ask a question. Has anyone actually gone on an invasive hunt, gone looking for these things, ordered them, that kind of thing? You have, sorry. So the first one, because any kind of incentive program involves members of the general public, they may be untrained in proper methods of capturing and handling the target species. So let's go through some of these just to kind of show you. For example, if you're looking for pythons, they are large and aggressive animals. I would actually call this not so much as looking for pythons as more searching in the Everglades with 5 hours of tedium followed by 2 minutes of sheer absolute horror. And I'm speaking from experience. It was an interesting day. The other thing, lionfish, they carry a risk of envenomation. If you're not careful, you can end up in the hospital because of the venom in their spines. And there is also a possible risk of ciguatera poisoning, although I think more research is showing that that may not be the case for these fish. But you have to understand, what are the risks of actually eating the animal itself physically? Like any other animal, you need to do a check to make sure that it doesn't have pesticides, other kind of contaminants. Before encouraging harvest of mitten crabs in England, the British government did these tests to see if they had any sort of pesticide residue, any kind of contaminants, and they found that in this case, the crabs were fit for human consumption. It's not like something you have to do just for invasives, but people may forget that you have to do it for invasives just like you would for any other animal. And then Susan's already talked about deer. Commercial harvesting of wild red deer in New Zealand was halted after there were initial concerns that the deer were feeding in areas that had been poisoned to try to control the possum population. Wouldn't be very good if you ate the meat. They did test. They failed to find any sort of residue pesticides, and so therefore harvest was allowed to continue, albeit with some stricter monitoring and control. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the public doesn't hurt the ecosystem by doing the harvest. We've seen anecdotal videos, for example, where people are spearfishing for lionfish, where not only do they capture the lionfish, but the spear actually goes through the fish and hits the reef that the fish is on in the process, causing additional destruction. Again, additional training, making sure that the public knows what they're doing, they're trained in the proper safety methods, all can help protect the public and can help protect the ecosystem. Recommendations: determine the potential risks to human health and safety, and ensure that people are properly trained on the capture methods. A couple of other issues that you have to think about. The legal side of all this. Legal issues are important because invasives can return. If even there's just a small number remaining, you're going to have to work with private property owners. So, for example, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources regulations allow inspectors to enter private lands with a warrant if needed to help ensure that prohibited species are not present. You may have to develop other kind of methods to make sure that you're able to collaborate properly with private property folks. In addition, you may have state and federal laws that may restrict the movement of species, which can impact the marketability of some of those. For example, over in Fish and Wildlife Service, I help operate the Injurious Wildlife Program. If a species is listed as injurious wildlife, you're not allowed to move it between states or import it into the United States. For species like carp, which I'll talk about shortly, those species are actually, the preferred market for those is live. And so if someone captures a carp here and tries to move it from one state to another lot before shipping it overseas, they are theoretically in violation of the law. I'm still thinking about the pythons. And so that's something that needs to be considered. How do you manage these different species? And what is the preferred commercial product? You also need to think about bag limits and other restrictions. For example, Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission has declared open seas on lionfish. Take as many as you want, not a problem. The other thing, you may have to, again, encourage an incentive to establish populations, even without a commercial incentive. In the fisheries community, you often get what are called the bucket biologists or the midnight managers. These are people who have a preferred species that they like to fish for. In the case of the picture here, smallmouth bass. And after we've done restoration on a lake, on a stream, on another type of habitat, someone will go in at midnight under the radar screen and reseed that lake that we just spent all that money with their preferred fishing source. Doesn't even need to be a commercial activity. They just want to have fun doing it. They go in and they introduce the species. So that's something you have to be considerate about. And as I've already mentioned before, in regards to the Cobra effect, you do have a potential for fraud. You may encourage a bounty. People may start breeding the species in their own home, reseeding another area. Just something else to watch out for. The other thing, Susan's already mentioned the tyranny of small numbers. Okay, so at some point, people are not going to want to go out and catch whatever it is you're telling them they should go out and catch. They're just not going to get the return on their investment. Someone wants to go out and have a good day fishing, a good day hunting. Well, they want to get some kind of guarantee that they're actually going to catch a big fish, catch a lot of fish, might be able to bag that deer. Well, if they're not able to catch the species without using a lot of effort, well, what happens? Again, you start to get the population rebounding. So you may need to have some kind of incentive or some other mechanism in place to deal with that smaller population. And then in a moment, I also was thinking about this as a flip side to this, where you even need to have an incentive when the population is high, and I'll cover that in a moment. Recommendations here, again, you want to monitor for unintended consequences. Make sure you're watching out. Employ adaptive management. As you encourage harvest, if you can get the population down to a certain size, start using other control mechanisms or have those ready to go. And then determine the appropriate points for government intervention. What are the laws you need? What are the regulations you need to make sure that this works? Let's talk about carp. So we're all seeing a tremendous demand right now for Asian carp, both on the marketability side, as well as the efforts in the Great Lakes, the demand to try to keep the fish from getting into the Great Lakes. And governments, federal and state, have already spent billions of dollars to try to help manage the species. So they're the subject of intense study, and numerous efforts are underway to look at how do you control them, including harvest. There is a strong demand for them in Asia. So some of the applications, federal and other partners have an agreement looking at harvest under the 2012 Asian Carp Control Strategy Framework. You're seeing private industry taking a big interest in this. Have any of you heard of silverfin? Okay, so that's the new name that they're trying to give Asian carp to make them seem more palatable. If you've ever gone into a restaurant and you've ever ordered Chilean sea bass, its original name was the Patagonian toothfish. Not quite as sexy. They come up with Chilean sea bass, and all of a sudden it becomes this hot fish. It's the same kind of thing. So can you work to promote carp by calling it a different name? And then there are also cooperative efforts. We've already talked briefly about the humanitarian aid. Here's where you're going to get into some issues with carp. The studies seem to show that harvest can work, but you've got to watch out for a couple of different things. One is the larger fish are the more desirable. It's tougher to get commercial fishermen to go after the smaller fish. They're just not as desirable in the market, and the smaller fish actually cause more problems for gear. So you're going to have to encourage commercial fishery operations to go after the smaller fish if you're going to have any sort of impact on the population. Research is also shedding light on the benefits and issues that surround the carp. Let's talk about some of the government responsibilities that are here. The first is, we've actually seen this, both Susan and I and people out in the Midwest. So NOAA Fish and Wildlife are actually getting these calls from people right now saying, we want to go out and we'll catch all the carp. Just give us a startup fund so we can get the boats, get the processing operations up and running. Well, should we actually be doing that? I don't have a real answer for you. There's a question of should you actually be providing seed funds to a company that's likely going to get a profit off of harvesting the species anyway. The flip side of this, we actually met with someone who had an interesting twist on this. They came to us and we said, well, why should we be providing funding to you if you're going to be able to raise those monies yourself just in the process of catching the fish? You'll earn a profit. Well, their business model specifically said they want to exterminate the carp. They want to work themselves out of business. No bank would be willing to give them money. They were turned away for a loan. So that's why they were going to the government to try to raise funds. So that's one issue. The other thing you need to think about then is, okay, We are still investigating all these other methods for harvesting carp. What happens if we come up with a method for controlling carp that succeeds? U.S. Geological Survey right now is doing some really cool work looking at different feed types that only carp would eat if you throw them out into the wild. That would effectively then poison the carp but wouldn't hurt any other native fisheries. So what if you really could come up with this magic bullet or something that could really have an impact on the population? Well, if there's a private venture that's already gone out and is trying to spend money to harvest carp, do we owe them a responsibility to allow them to recoup their investment? And then the other thing is, do you need regulations that inhibit or help the markets? The other thing I want to touch on is, so we've already talked about the tyranny of small numbers. There's also a tyranny of large numbers here. In order to have any dent on our Asian carp population, the research suggests that you have to knock down 70% of the population every year. Is it possible that a commercial fishing operation might satiate itself at a lower level? They catch all the fish they can. Well, if they're not catching enough, you're not going to knock down the population. So do you need an incentive, essentially a type of, whatever you want to call it, to encourage them to go higher and above what they can already catch, to invest more gear? One thing to think about. Eradication isn't always your optimal choice. In some cases, it may be more effective to aim for a level of control that keeps the level of damage done for the invasive species to some acceptable level. So let's take a look here at two different examples. Here you have sea lamprey on your left, which is not done through an incentive-based program, and northern pikeminnow on the right. And they offer really different contrasting examples of management. In this case, their goals are very similar, not to knock down the population. With sea lamprey, you're just simply trying not to eradicate, but to keep the population to a manageable level in the Great Lakes that allows other populations to recover and support the fishery that really is so valuable up in the Great Lakes region. Likewise with northern pikeminnow, they're not trying for eradication. What they're trying to do is keep the larger fish away so that the smaller juvenile salmonids have a chance of surviving. And in both cases, both of these programs are successful, but they're long-term efforts. This has been going on for years. In the case of Fish and Wildlife Service, we're controlling sea lamprey through active management efforts on the part of government and state and other partner agencies. We use lampricides, poisons essentially that we put in the water that target specifically lamprey, and we sterilize the males. If any of you have seen this, we have a special machine where we catch the males, drop them through, they get sterilized, they go back out in the water and can't mate. Whereas with the case of the pikeminnow, there actually is a prize that gets offered. Every single fish that someone catches is worth $4 to $8. Special tag fish are worth $500. It's actually a pretty good deal. When you look at their website, they have a list of the top 20 producers, essentially a contest label, if you will. Anyone want to take a guess actually how much the #1 person made last year? They made $70,000 just doing this. And the thing is okay, so you think that that would spur an incentive to start growing these fish naturally or in a lab somewhere, that kind of thing. They haven't seen it yet. In fact, in the Pacific Northwest, when they've done these studies, they've actually found that this bounty program is the most cost-effective solution. This is their method of helping to maintain salmonid populations. So they've done the economic work, they've compared it to other methods, and they decided that yes, it's a long-term effort that they have to continually inject money into, but compared to the other methods that are available right now for controlling pikeminnow, this is the most effective. Likewise, for sea lamprey, you're not going to eradicate the population, but this constant influx of resources every year has helped protect the Great Lakes. So here are the takeaways from that one. Define your management objectives. Determine, are you looking at eradication? Are you looking at some level of control? There are going to be costs. You can't just tell people go out and fish. You're going to have to inject funds into whatever you do every year. And then incorporate adaptive management as needed. Outreach, also really critical. Hopefully some of you have now seen some of these efforts in the media. You know, what is going on? What are the problems? Where can we actually go find some of these fish? So events such as the Python Challenge was never intended to eliminate or reduce the python problem. You've already seen how hard they are to find in the wild. Rather, the Florida commissioners who are operating this effort were hoping to raise awareness about the value of the Everglades, the problem of the snakes. What are these things doing? It was not intended as a control mechanism. They are potentially planning another effort in the future, and the same messages are going to be harped on, that the pythons are decimating mammal populations in the Everglades. They're decimating bird populations, and that we have to continue looking for options to save the river of grass. Management goals have to be communicated. Another Florida example, this one was a failure. In Silver River State Park, there was a population of invasive rhesus monkeys that the state was trying to control. They were doing this by capturing the monkeys and then giving them over to research laboratories. That raised tremendous concerns from the animal rights groups and others who had ethical issues with doing this. And so in that case, the control effort just wasn't deemed to be successful. You have to look at communicating to the public, what is it you're trying to do, why are these species harmful, and build that support slowly. There are other efforts that are also working to promote outreach, but I think the word is still out. Around here, have any of you ever gone fishing for snakehead? Oh, you have? Okay. So you caught one. Did you catch any? Was it fun?
It was a lot of work.
A lot of work.
The hook broke.
Okay. So, there are these efforts right now to help encourage this fishery, including the Maryland and Virginia Potomac Snakehead Tournament. I think the word is still out as to whether or not that effort will be successful. I do think that awareness is growing, although when I got married earlier this year, I did try to get snakehead on the menu. Both my wife and the caterer both said no, so not everyone is latched onto this idea that this is an invasive that's worth catching. I think there's some potential there. So anyway, so strong public outreach can do a couple of things for you. It's going to raise awareness with the public about why invasives are a problem in general. It's going to help train them in the proper methods for catching the species. And you're also going to help address then some of these moral, these cultural issues that may come up. And you may also be able to raise awareness with the decision makers, the policy makers who have to fund these efforts about why these things are bad. So for all those reasons, incorporate outreach, really think about it. Okay, we've just given you a lot of information, and we know we have. If you're going to take away anything from this, what are the key things here? The first is that harvest itself and incentivizing it is species specific and it's region dependent. It's not going to work everywhere universally. You have to look at the species, you have to look at where you're actually going after it. Good planning and monitoring are as essential as for any other option. You can't just simply not simply open up the floodgates and hope that people will go out and catch whatever it is you're asking them to catch. You have to look at adaptive management. You have to consider other steps that will be needed. When will they be needed? How do you implement them? And then the other thing is, finally, as we've talked about, hey, it's cool. I have a small collection of these things. It looks good. It tastes good. I think it's ultra fashionable, but ultimately, it's not free. There are costs. In doing this work, it's still ongoing. We encourage you to explore harvest, keep it as one tool in your arsenal. We do have some time for questions. We'll want to ask a couple, hopefully get a couple from you. We do want to thank a few people for helping us with this work. This has actually been the result of about 2 years worth of work. We have copies of the paper on the table back there as well. So a couple of different folks. One is the Mississippi River Basin Panel actually did some other related work on this issue, looking at how do you decontaminate equipment, that kind of thing. So there are recommendations that are also out there. We also want to thank the National Invasive Species Council, Invasive Species Advisory Committee. That's a federal FACA group. Those of you might not be familiar with the federal bureaucracy. And they are an advisory group that actually produced recommendations similar to ours on this issue earlier this year. And we're hopefully going to be able to see some results from that following up in the next couple of months. So Bob Wilchar, who chaired that group, we owe him a debt of gratitude. And then last but not least, on her last day, we are so crushed. We really want to thank Lori Williams from the National Invasive Species Council for all of her work over the last couple of years. She's been a strong supporter of us, has provided encouragement, has even thrown a couple of recipes at us, so for that we appreciate it. And then, like I said, we'd like to open it up for some questions. We also have in the back over there a sample of kudzu blossom jelly. Please feel free to help yourself, get a taste for it, order it from the Old Mill. They didn't pay me for that commercial. And we'll open it up to any thoughts or questions. Thanks again for the time.